The thing about saying a true thing out loud is that you never get to choose who is standing behind you when you say it. Daniel Reyes did not know this yet. He was about to learn it in the worst and best way a man can learn anything, which is all at once, in a single sentence, in a room full of beings who could end his species with a word. But in the half-second before he said it, and I want to slow that half-second down, because everything that mattered lived inside it, Daniel Reyes was simply a tired junior translator at the end of a very long day, standing at the edge of a vast obsidian hall, watching a procession he did not fully understand, and thinking a thought he had no intention of speaking. He was 31 years old. He had been the most junior member of the human delegation for 11 months, which is a polite way of saying he carried things, fetched things, and translated the parts of the negotiation too small to trust to anyone important. He was good at his job in the way that invisible people are good at their jobs, which is to say no one had ever noticed him doing it. And on this particular evening, on a world whose name human throats could not properly shape and so rendered simply as the throne, he was standing against a cold black wall at the close of the 7th day of the most important negotiation in human history, holding a data slate he was too exhausted to read, and watching the Vorr. You should know a little about Daniel before the sentence, because the man matters, and because the people who tell this story badly skip the man and go straight to the sentence, and in skipping the man they lose the only thing that makes the sentence mean anything. Daniel Reyes had not come from anywhere important. He had grown up in a small coastal town that the maps barely bothered with, the kind of place people leave, and he had left it, and the thing that had carried him out was a gift he had never quite known what to do with, which was that he heard languages the way other people heard music. He could not explain it any more than a musician can explain perfect pitch. He simply heard the shape under the words, the architecture beneath the noise, and where other people learned languages by labor, he learned them by listening until the shape revealed itself. It had made him strange as a child and lonely as a young man, because a person who hears what you mean instead of what you say is a difficult person to lie to, and people do not always want to be near someone they cannot lie to. By the time the Vorr came into human skies, and the desperate scramble began to find anyone at all, who could learn their impossible tongue, Daniel Reyes was a quiet 30-year-old who had made a small life out of a large gift, and who had learned, the way lonely people learn, to keep his truest observations to himself, because the world had taught him that saying them out loud only ever cost him something. That is the man. Remember him, because in a few minutes he is going to forget, for one fatal merciful instant, the lesson the world spent 30 years teaching him, and he is going to say a true thing out loud, and it is going to change 2 civilizations. He was good at his job, in the way that invisible people are good at their jobs. The senior translators handled the formal sessions, the treaty language, the great grinding clauses about borders and tribute and the movement of fleets. Daniel handled the margins, the muttered remarks, the side conversations, the small human exchanges that needed rendering when a Vorr lord deigned to address an underling. He was, in the strict hierarchy of the delegation, a tool that the important people picked up when they needed something small translated and set down again without thanks. He did not resent this. He had spent his life being the person at the edge of the room, and the edge of the room, he had found, was the best place to actually hear what was being said. From the edge of the room you saw everything and were seen by no one, and Daniel had built a career and very nearly a self out of that exact position. The listener no one notices, the man against the wall. It is worth knowing, too, that he was tired in a way that went deeper than the 7th day. 11 months on the throne had worn the whole delegation down to wire and nerve, but it had worn Daniel down differently, because Daniel was the one who heard everything. The senior people could tune out the Vorr when the session ended. Daniel never could, because his gift did not have an off switch, and so for 11 months he had heard not only the words the Vorr spoke to the humans, But the words the Vorr spoke to each other, the casual contempt, the way the lords referred to the human delegation in their own tongue when they believed the humans could not parse the fast court dialect. And Daniel could parse it, all of it. And he had spent 11 months absorbing exactly how little the Vorr thought of the species he was there to save. He had heard himself and everyone he worked with described as soft, as brief, as a candle flame species, here and gone, hardly worth the breath of negotiation. He had carried that for 11 months without telling anyone, because what would be the point, and it had hollowed him out in a quiet way. And on the 7th night of the final week, he was standing against the wall holding all of it, the exhaustion and the contempt he had overheard, and the 30 years of learning to keep his truest thoughts behind his teeth. And he was, though he did not know it, exactly one small, unguarded moment away from putting all of it down. I should tell you about the Vorr because you cannot understand what Daniel said, or why it nearly killed everyone, or why it didn't, without understanding the people who heard it. The Vorr were old, and they were beautiful, and they were cruel, and they were cruel precisely because they were beautiful, in the way that a thing which has never once in its history been told no becomes cruel without ever deciding to. They ruled 400 systems. They had ruled them for so long that rule was not a thing they did but a thing they were, the way water is wet. And at the center of the Vorr, at the center of the 400 systems, at the center of the obsidian hall on the world called the throne, was the queen. The cruelty of the Vorr is worth dwelling on, because it was not the loud cruelty of a species that enjoys causing pain. It was something colder and more total than that, and Daniel had spent 11 months learning its exact shape. The Vorr were cruel the way a mountain is cruel to the things that fall from it without malice, without even attention, simply as a consequence of being vast and hard and indifferent. When the Vorr took a world, they did not torture it. They did not need to. They simply rearranged it according to their will and ground down anything that did not fit. And they did this without hatred, because hatred would have required them to consider the world worth hating, and they did not consider the worlds beneath them worth anything at all except as extensions of their own power. They had unmade 100 civilizations this way, gently, absent-mindedly, the way you might brush crumbs from a table without once thinking of the crumbs. The human delegation had studied the records of those 100 civilizations in the long briefings before they came to the throne, and the records were the most frightening thing any of them had ever read, not because they were full of screaming, but because they were so quiet. The Vorr had ended 100 peoples and barely noticed doing it. That was the thing humanity was negotiating with. That was the indifference ambassador HSU had spent 4 years trying to find a foothold in, and had not found one, because there was no foothold in indifference. There was only the long, slow slide toward becoming the 101st quiet record in the Vorr archive. Now, here is the thing about the Queen, and it is the hinge of the entire story, so hold it carefully. The Vorr did not have beauty. I do not mean they were ugly. I mean they did not possess the concept. Their language, which Daniel had spent 11 months learning until it lived in his sleep, had no word for beautiful, no word for lovely, no word for any of the soft, useless human things that describe the pleasure of simply looking at a thing and being glad it exists. The Vorr described one another and described their queen only in the language of power. She was the apex. She was the unchallenged. She was the one before whom. She was the final word and the closed door and the weight that does not lift. Every title the Vorr had ever given their queen across 10,000 years was a title of dominance, because dominance was the only axis along which the Vorr could perceive value. A thing was worth noticing if it could destroy you. A being was worth honoring if it could end you. The queen was honored above all beings in 400 systems because the queen could end anything, and that ending, that absolute, unquestioned, 10,000-year capacity for ending, was the only thing the Vorr had ever seen when they looked at her. No one had ever looked at the queen and simply found her beautiful. The concept did not exist. There was no one in 400 systems who could have found her beautiful, because finding beautiful was not a thing the Vorr did, and so the Queen, in 10,000 years of being the most honored being in the known galaxy, had never once been seen. She had been feared. She had been obeyed. She had been titled and bowed to and dreaded. But she had never been looked at by anyone who simply liked the look of her, because no such person existed anywhere her power reached, and her power reached everywhere. And so, she was the loneliest beautiful thing in the galaxy and did not even have the word to know it. This is the Queen who was about to walk past Daniel Reyes. And this is the man who was about to, without thinking, without meaning to, without any idea what he was doing, become the first being in 10,000 years to see her. The procession came down the length of the obsidian hall. The negotiations had recessed for the evening rite, some formal Vorr ceremony of closing the day, and the human delegation had been instructed to stand at the edges, against the walls, and be still, and watch, and above all be silent, because the Vorr considered human speech during the evening rite to be a provocation, and the negotiations were at a delicate point, and one wrong word could collapse 11 months of work and leave humanity where it had been before the Vorr arrived in its sky, which was small and frightened, and one carelessly worded refusal away from being ended. Daniel knew all of this. He was tired, but he was not stupid. He was, in fact, the most gifted linguist the human delegation had, which was the only reason a junior nobody had been allowed in the hall at all. He knew the rules. He intended to keep them. He stood against the cold black wall and watched the Queen come down the hall in the center of her procession, and he did the thing he had been trained not to do, which was to have a human reaction to a Vorr. Because the Queen was beautiful. I have to be careful here, because it would be easy to make this a small thing, a man finding an alien attractive, and it was not that, it was not anything like that. Daniel did not desire the Queen. What happened to Daniel in that moment was older and stranger and more human than desire. He looked at the Queen of the Vorr, at the long architecture of her, the way the light moved across her like weather across a mountain, the terrible economy of a body that had been shaped by 10,000 years of being the apex of everything, and some part of Daniel that was too tired to stay locked away simply opened, the way it opens when you come over a hill and see the sea for the first time, or when you look up in a strange city, and the moon is enormous and orange and low, and you have no thought of owning it or using it or being safe from it. You only think without deciding to, oh, that's beautiful. It is important that you understand what this cost the part of him that had learned, over 30 years, never to say such things. Daniel had spent 11 months on the throne hearing the Vorr describe his people as a candle flame species, brief and soft and barely worth the breath. He had every reason, standing against that wall, to look at the Queen of the Vorr and feel only fear, or only the cold professional assessment of a man cataloging a threat. That would have been the safe thing to feel, the trained thing, the thing his 30 years had taught him. And instead, because he was too tired to hold the trained thing in place, the untrained thing came up through him, the thing he had been born with and spent his life learning to hide, the simple, helpless human capacity to look at something and be glad it exists, to find it beautiful for no reason and to no purpose, to be moved by a thing that could destroy you and to feel, underneath the fear, not fear at all, but a kind of awe that has no use and asks for nothing. The Vorr had no word for that capacity. It was the exact thing they had been blind to for 10,000 years. And Daniel Reyes, against a cold black wall on the 7th night of the most important negotiation in human history, felt it rise in him toward the most powerful being in the galaxy, and was too tired to push it back down. And because he was tired, and because the thought was so quiet and so true and so entirely without danger in his own mind, Daniel Reyes said it out loud. He did not say it loudly. He said it the way you say a thing to yourself, under your breath, a small exhale of words meant for no one. He said it in human English, which he assumed no Vorr in the hall could understand, because the Vorr had never bothered to learn the language of a species they considered beneath negotiation, and translation in the negotiations had always run one way, with Daniel and his colleagues rendering Vorr into English and English into Vorr, while the Vorr themselves listened only in their own tongue. He had no reason to think anyone could understand him. He was wrong about that, and the wrongness is the whole story, but he did not know it yet. He said quietly to himself, to the cold black wall, to the 11 months of exhaustion in his bones, "God, the Queen is so beautiful." And the hall went silent in a way that a hall full of people is never silent, the silence of a held breath multiplied by 1,000 throats, and Daniel Reyes felt the temperature of the room change against the back of his neck, and he understood, with the slow, cold horror of a man who has dropped something priceless and is watching it fall, that the procession had stopped, and that the reason it had stopped was him, and that the Queen of the Vorr was no longer walking past him. The Queen of the Vorr was standing directly behind him. Let me freeze the room here, because this is the moment, and I want you to see all of it. There were 200 beings in that hall. There were the Vorr of the court, the high lords and the blade bearers and the keepers of the rights, beings who had spent their entire lives in the orbit of the Queen's power, and had never once heard a being beneath them speak of her as anything but the apex and the unchallenged. There was the human delegation, 11 souls who had spent 11 months walking the knife edge of these negotiations, and who now, to the last of them, had gone the specific shade of pale that a person goes when they have watched a colleague step off a cliff, and are doing the physics of whether they will be pulled off after him. There was Ambassador HSU, the head of the human delegation, a woman of 60 who had given 4 years of her life to keeping humanity alive in the shadow of the Vorr, and who was, in this frozen moment, closing her eyes in the manner of a person watching the end of everything she had built. And there was the Queen. And here is the thing that no one in that hall understood yet, the thing it would take the rest of the night to understand, the thing I am telling you now so that you can watch for it as the room begins to move again. Every single being in that hall had heard Daniel's sentence as a catastrophe, and every single one of them was wrong about why. The Vorr lords heard a catastrophe because a being beneath the Queen had presumed to describe her, had spoken of the apex in some small human tongue, some unsanctioned word, an act of such breathtaking impertinence that several of the blade bearers had already moved their hands to the long ceremonial blades that were not. The humans had been assured, merely ceremonial. To speak of the Queen unbidden was death. To speak of her in a language the court could not parse was worse than death. It was an insult wrapped in a mystery, and the Vorr did not forgive mysteries. The humans heard a catastrophe because they understood the rules and knew that Daniel had broken the largest of them, and they were already in their minds, 11 months into the past, watching all of it turn to ash, watching humanity return to the small and frightened place it had been before, and worse than before, because now the Vorr would remember that humans could not be trusted to keep silent in a holy hall. But the Queen had heard something else entirely, and to understand what the Queen had heard, you have to know the one fact that not even the human delegation knew, the fact that changes everything, the fact I have been holding back because the Queen herself had held it back for 10,000 years. The Queen understood English. She had understood it for the entire 11 months. She had understood every word the human delegation had spoken in every session, every aside, every muttered frustration, every private remark the humans had made believing themselves unheard. Because the Queen of the Vorr had not become the Queen of the Vorr by being the strongest, that was a thing for the lords to believe, that was the story power tells about itself. The Queen had become the Queen and remained the Queen for 10,000 years by being the one who listened, by learning every tongue of every species that came before her throne, by understanding everything while appearing to understand only what was sanctioned. She listened. It was her secret and her weapon and the loneliest thing about her, because in 10,000 years of listening to everything said in her presence, she had heard herself described 10,000 times, and every single description in every tongue had been a description of her power. The apex, the unchallenged, the weight that does not lift. She had listened to the whole galaxy talk about her for 10,000 years, and the whole galaxy had only ever talked about what she could do to it. Think about what that does to a mind across 10,000 years. Think about being able to understand every word spoken about you, by everyone always, and discovering, century after century, that no matter the species, no matter the tongue, no matter whether they spoke of you in fear or in flattery or in the careful diplomatic neutrality of those who came to bargain, every word was about your power. Every word measured you as a threat. The ambassadors who came to her throne praised her endlessly in the polished language of those who want something, and she understood every word of their praise and knew every word of it to be a transaction, a thing offered in the hope of a thing received. And so the praise was worth nothing, less than nothing, because praise that wants something is not about you at all. It is about the wanting. And the enemies who cursed her in the moments before she unmade them, cursed her power too, raged against what she could do, and so even their hatred was a kind of acknowledgement of the only thing anyone ever saw. In 10,000 years of perfect listening, the Queen of the Vorr had never once heard a single word spoken about her that was not, at bottom, about power hers, or the speaker's hope of surviving it. She knew the inner voice of the entire galaxy, because she had listened to all of it, and the entire galaxy, when it spoke of her, spoke only of fear and want, and a being who hears only fear and want for 10,000 years comes to believe, reasonably, on the evidence, that fear and want are all there is, and that she herself is nothing but the thing that is feared and the thing that is wanted, an apex and an object, never once a self that someone might simply be glad existed. That was the prison. Not a prison of stone. She ruled 400 systems. She could go anywhere, do anything, end anyone. It was a prison of language, the same prison her whole people lived in without knowing it, except that hers was the loneliest cell in it, because she was the one everyone described and no one saw. And she had stopped hoping, somewhere in the long middle of those 10,000 years, that it would ever be otherwise. She had folded the hope away the way you fold away a thing you have decided is childish, and she had become the weight that does not lift, and she had told herself that the weight was who she was and not a thing she carried, because a thing you carry can be set down and grieved for, and a thing you are cannot, and it is easier across 10,000 years to be the weight than to keep grieving the lightness you have lost. And now a tired human who did not know she was listening, who did not know she could understand him, who had no possible reason to flatter a being he believed could not hear him. A tired human had looked at her at the end of a long day and said a word she did not have, a word her language could not hold, a word that described not what she could destroy, but what she simply, helplessly was. Beautiful. The Queen had ruled 400 systems for 10,000 years, and in all that time, in all those words, no one had ever once told her she was beautiful, because no one had ever once found her beautiful, because beauty requires being seen by someone who wants nothing from you, and no one who stands beneath an apex ever wants nothing. And here, against a cold black wall, in a language he thought she could not understand, a being who wanted nothing, who could not possibly have wanted anything, who did not even know she was there, had given her the one thing 10,000 years of absolute power had never been able to take, because it is the one thing in the universe that cannot be taken, that can only be freely given. That means nothing at all unless it is given freely. He had found her beautiful and meant it and said so, alone to himself, expecting no reward and no consequence, simply because it was true. This is the moment the room hung in. Daniel, frozen against the wall, certain he had just killed everyone. The lords, hands on their blades, waiting for the word that would turn the human into a smear on the obsidian. The ambassador, eyes closed, 4 years collapsing, and the Queen behind Daniel silent, holding in her vast and lonely chest a feeling she had no word for either, a feeling she had not felt in 10,000 years, a feeling that had arrived in a language her own tongue could not contain, carried by a tired man who thought he was alone. Daniel turned around. He turned around because there was nothing else to do, because a man who has heard the room go silent behind him cannot stand forever facing the wall, because some last reserve of dignity in him decided that if he was going to die for a sentence, he would at least face the thing that killed him. He turned around slowly, the data slate forgotten in his hand, and he looked up, because the queen was very tall, taller than the tallest human, built on the scale of 10,000 years. And he found himself looking directly into the eyes of the queen of the Vorr, the apex, the unchallenged, the being who could end his species with a word, and who was standing close enough that he could see the weather of light move across her, and who was looking down at him with an expression that no Vorr lord in that hall had ever seen on her face in their entire lives, because it was not an expression of power. And Daniel, who was a translator, who had spent 11 months learning to read the smallest movements of Vorr faces because his life and his species' future depended on it, did the second unthinkable thing he would do that night. He understood the expression. He read it correctly, in the half-second he had, the way a gifted translator reads the thing beneath the words. He had expected to see fury, or contempt, or the cold appraisal of a predator deciding how much effort the killing would take. He saw none of those. He saw, on the face of the most powerful being in 400 systems, something he recognized instantly, because he had seen it on human faces his whole life, on the faces of people at parties standing alone at the edge of the room, on the faces of the elderly in waiting rooms, on his own face in the mirror on the worst nights of his life. He saw loneliness. He saw a being who had just been seen for the first time and did not know what to do about it, and was terrified the apex of 400 systems, terrified that it would not happen again. And so Daniel Reyes, junior translator, 31 years old, 11 months the most invisible member of the human delegation, made a choice. He could have apologized. Every protocol, every instinct, every screaming nerve in his body told him to apologize, to grovel, to render himself as small as possible and beg the forgiveness of the apex for his impertinence. That was the safe move. That was the move that might, possibly, save the negotiations, by reframing the whole thing as the error of a tired underling who had forgotten himself. He did not apologize, because he understood in that half-second, reading her face, that an apology would take it back. An apology would say, "I did not mean it. It was a mistake. Please forget I spoke." And he looked at the loneliness on the face of the queen of the Vorr, the 10,000-year loneliness of a being who had never once been seen, and he understood that the cruelest thing he could possibly do, crueler than the insult the lords thought he had given, crueler than anything, would be to take it back. To tell her that the one time in 10,000 years someone had found her beautiful, it had been a slip of the tongue, an error, nothing. So instead, Daniel Reyes looked up at the queen of the Vorr, in the silence of 200 held breaths, with the blade-bearers' hands on their blades and the ambassador's eyes closed, and the fate of his entire species balanced on the next thing he said, and he did the bravest thing I have ever heard of a human being doing. He said it again. On purpose, looking her in the eye, so that she would know it was not a mistake. "You are," he said quietly, steadily, in her own tongue this time, in the Vorr language he had spent 11 months learning, reaching for a word that did not exist and building it himself out of the pieces the language gave him, assembling in real time a word the Vorr had never had. "You are worth looking at. Not because of what you can do. Just because you are. I'm sorry. I know I'm not supposed to speak, but someone should have told you a long time ago and no one did, and that isn't right. You are beautiful. There should be a word for it. I'll make one if I have to." And he bowed his head, not in the grovel of the conquered, but in the simple respect of one person who has told another person the truth, and he waited to find out whether the truth would kill him. The silence after that was the longest silence in the history of human contact with the Vorr. I have heard it described by every member of the delegation who survived that night, and no two of them describe it the same way, because each of them was living through their own private version of the end of the world. Ambassador HSU later said it lasted 1,000 years. Daniel himself said he stopped being able to feel his own heartbeat, and assumed, distantly, that it had stopped out of courtesy to spare him the wait. The Vorr Lord stood frozen, because the protocol that governed every moment of their lives had no instruction for this, no precedent, no right. A being beneath the Queen had described her, twice, the second time in flawless court Vorr, using a word that did not exist, and they did not know whether they were witnessing the highest blasphemy in 10,000 years or something else, something they had no name for, and the not knowing held their hands frozen on their blades. And the Queen of the Vorr looked down at the small, tired human who had just built her a word, and for the first time in 10,000 years, the apex of 400 systems did a thing that the Vorr had no right for, and no precedent for, and no name for. A thing that sent a sound through the obsidian hall that not one being in it had ever heard from her. A sound the lords would spend the rest of their lives trying to forget and failing. She wept. Not the way a defeated thing weeps. The Queen of the Vorr had never been defeated, and was not defeated now. She wept the way a thing weeps when a door it had stopped believing in opens at last. The way you weep when you have been alone so long that you have built your whole self around the aloneness, made it your throne and your armor and your name, and then someone reaches through all of it, casually, by accident, on a tired evening, and touches the part of you that the aloneness was protecting, and you discover that it is still alive in there, the soft thing, the thing that wanted to be seen. The thing you had buried under 10,000 years of being the weight that does not lift. She wept because the weight had lifted. For one moment, in the eyes of one tired human who wanted nothing from her, the weight had lifted, and she remembered what it had been like, before the 400 systems and the 10,000 years, to be a thing that could simply be looked at and found lovely. And the negotiations did not collapse that night. I will tell you the shape of what happened, though the shape is almost too neat to believe, except that I have seen the records and I believe it. The Queen of the Vorr lifted one hand, the same gesture that had, 10,000 times across 10,000 years, meant a death, and the blade bearers, trained to that gesture as a dog is trained to a whistle, began to move toward Daniel. And the Queen spoke a single word in court Vorr that stopped them, and the word was not a word of power. The word was the word Daniel had just built for her, the word that did not exist, the assembled from pieces word for the thing that is worth looking at simply because it is, and by speaking it, by accepting it, by making it real, by adding it with her own voice to the 10,000-year-old language of the Vorr, the Queen did something no human treaty could ever have achieved. She changed what the Vorr were able to see. Because a language is not just a way of describing the world. A language is the set of things a people are able to notice. For 10,000 years the Vorr had been unable to notice beauty, unable to find anything worth honoring except power, and that blindness was the engine of their cruelty, because a people who can only see power will only ever value power, and will grind everything that is not power beneath them without even understanding that they are doing it. And in a single night, a tired human translator who said a true thing out loud, not realizing the Queen was standing behind him, had given the Vorr a new word, and the Queen had made it real, and a people who could suddenly notice beauty were, for the first time in 10,000 years, a people who could be something other than cruel. I want to be honest that it was not instant, and it was not magic, and the new word did not sweep through 400 systems overnight and turn a cruel empire kind by morning. That is not how words work, and it is not how peoples change. What happened was smaller and slower and truer than that. The word existed now, where before it had not, and the Queen had spoken it, which meant it was sanctioned, which meant that across the court and then across the throne and then, over the years that followed, across the 400 systems, the Vorr began, cautiously, a few at a time, the way a frozen thing thaws from the edges, to be permitted to notice the thing the word named. A blade-bearer who had spent his whole life seeing only power looked one evening at the light on the obsidian and felt something he now had a word for, and the word let him keep the feeling instead of discarding it. A keeper of the rites looked at a captured world scheduled for the usual absent-minded unmaking and saw, for the first time, that it was worth looking at, and hesitated. And the hesitation was a thing that had never happened before in 10,000 years. The cruelty of the Vorr had never been malice. It had been blindness, and you cannot cure malice but you can cure blindness, and the cure had a name now, and the name had been built by a tired human against a cold black wall. The treaty that ended 11 months of negotiation and 400 years of Vorr expansion was signed 3 days later, and it was not signed because humanity had proven itself strong. It was signed because the Queen of the Vorr had finally met a species that could see the thing her own people had been blind to, and she did not want to grind such a species beneath her. She wanted to keep it. She wanted, after 10,000 years, to be near the only people in the galaxy who had ever looked at her and seen something other than a weapon. The treaty's terms were generous past anything the human delegation had dared to hope, and the senior negotiators spent weeks afterward trying to understand what leverage had won them, combing back through the 11 months for the strategic masterstroke they must have made and somehow not noticed making. There was no masterstroke. There was a tired man and a true sentence and a queen who had waited 10,000 years to hear it. Ambassador HSU, who was wiser than the negotiators, never looked for the masterstroke. She had been in the hall. She had closed her eyes and waited to die and opened them to find the world remade. And she understood, in the way that only someone who has watched it happen can understand, that the thing that had saved her species was the one thing no negotiation could ever have produced on purpose, because the moment you produce it on purpose it stops being the thing. Daniel Reyes did not save humanity that night with a clever argument or a strategic concession or a show of strength. He saved humanity, and though he never thought of it this way, he saved the Vorr too, saved them from the prison of a language that could only see power by being too tired to keep a true thing to himself, and then too kind to take it back. I have told this story many times now because it is my job to tell it, and because the people who hear it always ask the same question at the end, and I will answer it now before you ask. They ask whether Daniel meant to do it, whether it was strategy, whether the most junior translator in the human delegation had secretly understood that the Queen could hear him, had known about her 10,000 years of loneliness, had engineered the whole impossible moment to crack open 400 systems with a single perfect word. No, he did not. That is the entire point, and if you miss it, you have missed everything. The reason it worked, the only reason it could ever have worked, is that he meant it, and that he did not know she was listening. If he had known, it would have been flattery, and the Queen had heard 10,000 years of flattery and could smell it across a hall. The only thing in the universe that could have reached her was a true thing said by someone who expected nothing. And the only way to say a true thing while expecting nothing is to say it when you think you are alone. Daniel saved 2 civilizations precisely because he was not trying to. He was just a tired man who looked at something vast and lonely and beautiful and could not stop himself from saying so. The thing about saying a true thing out loud is that you never get to choose who is standing behind you when you say it. Daniel Reyes said the truest small thing of his life into what he thought was empty air, and the loneliest being in the galaxy was standing behind him, and had been listening for 10,000 years for exactly that, without knowing it, without a word for it, without any hope that it would ever come. And it came from a junior translator too tired to lie. On the 7th night of a negotiation he was too unimportant to matter to, in a language he thought she couldn't understand. She understood. She had always understood. That was the loneliest part, and then, for one night, because one tired man could not keep a true thing to himself, it was the part that saved everything. I know all of this because I was the ambassador's aide, and I stood 3 places down the wall from Daniel Reyes, and I heard him say it, and I closed my eyes like everyone else and waited to die. And I have spent the years since trying to learn the lesson he taught me without meaning to teach anyone anything. The lesson that the most powerful thing a person can do is not to flatter the powerful, and not to fear them, but to simply, honestly, when no one is supposed to be listening, tell the truth about what is beautiful, because somewhere always, someone lonely is standing behind you, listening, waiting, having given up hope of ever being seen. Tell the truth about what is beautiful. You never know who is standing behind you. You never know whose 10,000 years of silence you are about to end.